Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fokowski, and today we're going to look at Jefferson's presidency, in particular one of his more controversial acts that will be the embargo of 1807, which somewhat tarnishes his presidency in his second term. But again, recall that when Jefferson became president, he had these idealistic visions as to how the republic should be run. Now that's great to have these ideals and have these goals, but when they conflict with reality, there's sort of a problem, and that's going to be the issue for Jefferson. Now, in particular, as you'll probably know from world history last year, that France and Britain are constantly in a state of war. And in particular, when Napoleon comes to power, he's going to constantly be provoking war with Great Britain. Now, Britain is going to, which is reigning supreme on the seas, is going to try to thwart France in every way possible. So in particular, they passed something in Parliament known as the Orders in Council, which closed European ports under French control to any foreign shipping, and this would include American shipping. Now, the little asterisk involved is that it would first have to stop at a British port, otherwise it would be subject to seizure. So that's a little bit of a problem because remember the United States is wanting to remain neutral, especially Jefferson. And think back even to George Washington, who issued the Neutrality Proclamation. So that's a little bit of a problem. Meanwhile, the French are doing something similar in that they are trying to seize all merchant ships that enter the British ports. So the United States is very much in a predicament as it cannot trade with either nation without getting into entangling alliances. At the same time, we have impressment being used by both sides, but in particular, the British are going to use it, and it's going to spark something known as the Chesapeake Affair in 1807. And this is when a U.S. Navy ship is taken over by the British. And London, for the first time, will declare the right to seize sailors from a foreign warship. Again, this idea of impressment. And as the British are demanding this, the U.S. commander aboard the Navy ship refuses. What do the British do? Well, they fire upon the ship, and they kill 3 Americans and wounding 18 others. As a result, this is going to create a rash of anti-British sentiment, and this is ultimately going to lead the United States one step closer to war. Undoubtedly, Congress could declare war against Great Britain, but again, Jefferson, as one of his ideals of the Republic as to how it should be run, is that peace should trump all other things, including war. Now, as you see this political cartoon here, you see Napoleon sort of provoking Jefferson, while you have Great Britain also provoking Jefferson, and he's sort of caught in the middle. He sort of feels victimized by both sides, and this puts Jefferson in a very precarious position. So again, even though he's trying to remain neutral, it's very difficult when you have the Chesapeake Affair, and then you also have a number of merchant ships headed to Great Britain being seized by the French. I mean, there's no easy way to solve this. So if he, sides with France, well, he just made an enemy with Britain and vice versa. So he's going to try to remain neutral. And he comes up with this idea of what's known as peaceful coercion. This coincides with the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically forbids the export of all goods from the United States, whether they're on American or foreign ships. So again, this idea of peaceful coercion, because if France and Great Britain are relying on the U.S. for raw materials, well then he believes that this would theoretically force both sides to give up and allow the United States to continue trading without being impressed or without having their ships seized. So he thinks that refusing to trade with anyone will force these two opposing sides to allow the United States to remain neutral. But here's the problem. Jefferson doesn't anticipate that not only is this going to hurt the manufacturing industry up north in New England, which at this time, because of the Embargo Act of 1807, they are threatening to secede. You may have only thought this was a Civil War issue when the South was threatening secession, but as early as 1807, you have New England trying to become its own country. I mean, that's huge, and that shows how fragile at some points our republic is. And because of the embargo of 1807, you basically have the commerce of New England coming to a dead halt. And this is ultimately going to hurt New England far more than the British or the French. And it's not even New England that just hurt economically. Farmers in the South and the West are suffering as well. They can't export grain, cotton, tobacco. So it almost seemed to the average American citizen that Jefferson is waging war on his fellow citizens instead of Great Britain or France. Now, of course, this isn't going to prevent all trade from going on. There's going to be some illegal trade occurring around the Canadian border. So because of these talks of secession, Congress is very much alarmed, and it passes what's known as the Non-Intercourse Act, which allows the United States to trade with any country it wants to, with the exception of Great Britain and France. So you still have the Embargo Act to a certain degree in place, but it's only with Great Britain and France instead of all other countries. So now this allows trade to continue and open up with other locations around the world. But again, this is very much tarnishes Jefferson's presidency as he makes enemies not only in the South and the West, which support him, but definitely in New England, where they're talking about seceding from the Union. Now, embargoes are still even used today. One of the most famous ones are the ones imposed on Iran during Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency. And as you can see in this political cartoon, that sometimes embargoes don't always have the intended effect. As you can see in this political cartoon, it says, the more you squeeze, the bigger my head gets. Have the embargo acts worked? Well, they have hurt Iran economically, but at the same time, this has caused further resentment in Iran and has caused Ahmadinejad, when he was president, to further increase his nuclear ambitions, as that seems to be a recurring problem over the past few years. But ultimately, the embargo will eventually be repealed. It will fail after 15 months. And really why they fail is because Jefferson very much underestimates Great Britain. Jefferson believed that Great Britain depended too heavily upon Americans for trade. But think about Great Britain. It is a huge empire, and there are other locations aside from the United States that they can trade with. So in particular, they're going to get some crops from Latin America, and it wasn't that hard. On the other hand, France also could afford to tighten its belt without trading with the Americans. So, because of these reasons, that Jefferson really doesn't consider that Britain can trade with Latin America, that since Napoleon was conquering most of Europe, he could get a lot of trade from there. This embargo really doesn't work, and he ultimately miscalculates also how unpopular this embargo is going to be. He alienates the South, the West, where his political base is. And of course, as we said in earlier slides, he's going to very much alienate the New England areas even further. But what this ultimately does, this embargo, because we're not trading with anyone, this will help to lay the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. Because Americans are not trading with any foreign nation, this leaves them without a lot of foreign products. So how are Americans going to produce these products? Well, now they're going to have to produce them for themselves. And that's what the Industrial Revolution is all about. It's the increase of manufacturing. It's going to lead to the democratization of goods. So you're going to have all these products now readily available. So the United States, instead of trading with other nations, because it can't under this embargo, is going to have to produce these goods for themselves. So this will be very much instrumental for laying the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. And as we close this slide on the embargo, this picture very much represents the manufacturing sites in the north, the shipping industry. As you can see, not much is really happening. You have a couple of boats, but really that hustle and bustle in New England is gone as a result of the Embargo Act, and a lot of people suffer. There's high unemployment. The economy is going to suffer as well. And really, this was a very, very unpopular act. And again, Jefferson was all about free trade and neutrality. But if you're putting an embargo on American trade, that's not free trade. And again, there's another conflict once again. Our next president that we're going to be looking at will be Madison. He will be our fourth president, and as you see him pictured here, he is a Democratic Republican. With Madison, he's going to be dealing still with the same issues with Britain and France. That will be another common theme, which we'll get to in a minute. But what's also interesting about this election is that Federalists are going to gain a majority in Congress. If you recall, the Federalist Party is very much declining. It's an obsolete party. But remember back to Jefferson's presidency, the Embargo Act of 1807, that actually allows the Federalist Party to regain a resurgence. So they will now have a majority in Congress. It's like their last final act before they go away. So What's happening in Madison's presidency? Now, you'll remember the Non-Intercourse Act, which imposes an embargo on both France and Great Britain while allowing American trade with all other nations. Congress is going to dismantle the Non-Intercourse Act even further with something known as Macon's Bill number 2. Basically, what it says in a nutshell is that if Britain or France were to repeal its restrictions on American trade, the U.S. would impose an embargo against the other nation that was not repealing their restrictions. So, for example, if Britain were to repeal its restrictions on U.S. trade, then in return, the U.S. would impose an embargo on France, and vice versa. Ultimately, Napoleon seizes upon this opportunity because he wants to hurt the British even more and impose a further blockade against his enemy. Now, even though Napoleon agrees to this, Madison gives Great Britain 3 months to respond and 3 months to repeal its restrictions. Well, surprise, surprise, the British refuse, and ultimately this pulls the United States further away from neutrality, closer to France, and one step closer to war with Great Britain. So this political cartoon very much demonstrates how Britain and France were the world conquerors. You have Napoleon over here, basically carving up the world, while you have the British Prime Minister at this point, William Pitt, doing exactly the same thing as they wreak havoc on the world. Meanwhile, back in the United States, you have what are known as war hawks. These war hawks were congressmen from the South and the West, and they're sick of what's going on with the British. They're sick of impressment. They have the Chesapeake affair in the back of their minds. They're also sick of the British Orders in Council, which is hurting American trade. Meanwhile, out in present-day Indiana, the Shawnee brothers, in particular Tecumseh, they desire a confederacy with all the tribes east of the Mississippi. They want to gain unity in culture, and they want to get everyone together so that more numbers equal greater strength against the imposing Americans. However, you have the British in nearby Canada at this point secretly believed to be helping the Native Americans by supplying them with weapons as well as supplies, and they were even believed to be called scalp buyers, meaning that for every scalp that the Native Americans provided the British, they would be provided a sum of money. Well, guess whose heads are being scalped? Americans. Ultimately, Governor Harrison of the Indiana Territory brings together this army, will basically wipe out and destroy the Shawnee tribe. So Tecumseh's idealistic vision of having an Indian confederacy basically is wiped out. But really the main idea here is that this adds even further anti-British sentiment because they are believed to be secretly aiding the Native Americans at this point. So this places President Madison over the edge. Many believe that just wiping out the natives in their Canadian base would be necessary, so this chant becomes amongst these war hawks, take Canada, as well as take Spain. So the chant specifically is on to Canada, while the southern war hawks want to capture all of Florida. At this point they only have a small part of it, and that would be basically northwestern Florida where present-day Tallahassee is. But Madison and his fellow Republicans believe that they need to assert American rights to show that the United States was a very viable nation. They said that if they could not protect themselves through fighting, then it could be easily discredited, that it would have basically no credibility. As a result, Madison will ask Congress to vote for war, and it does. Support is mainly coming from the South and the West, but again, you have those opposing Federalists in the North, as well as some in the Middle Colonies who are very much against it. Remember, Federalists are very much aligned with the British. They're called Anglophiles. And they're sympathizing very much with the British, and they did not appreciate the Republican support of Napoleon. And in addition, the Federalists are not really big about expanding into Canada because if you think about Canada's layout, it's much more aligned with agrarian states, which again would increase the support of Republicans because a lot of Canada is open land, and hence you'll have more farmers and thus more Republicans, and as a result leading to the decrease in support of the Federalist Party. And as we close, just to give you an idea as to how much Federalists and New Englanders despise this new war, the War of 1812, New Englanders lent more money to Britain than to the federal treasury. Federalist farmers, the few that they were, sent many supplies enabling the British armies to invade New York, their own country. And New England governors, many of them, refused to permit their own militias from serving outside of their own states. So your book actually sums this up really well, that America has two enemies, the old and the new England. And we'll leave it there, and we'll continue this in our next lecture.